Lieutenant Sarah Chen pressed her stethoscope against the chest of the wounded Japanese soldier, her hands steady despite the chaos erupting around the field hospital on Iwo Jima. At 28 years old, she was one of the few Chinese-American nurses serving in the Pacific Theater, having volunteered for overseas duty despite facing discrimination both at home and within the military medical corps. But on this bloody February morning in 1945, as American forces fought desperately to secure the strategic island, Sarah faced a decision that would test every principle she had learned about medical ethics and human compassion. The Japanese soldier lying on her makeshift operating table was barely conscious, his uniform torn and bloodied from shrapnel wounds that had nearly severed his left arm. According to military protocol, enemy wounded were to be treated only after all American casualties had received care, and only then with minimal medical intervention necessary to keep prisoners alive for interrogation. But Sarah could see that without immediate surgery, this young man would bleed to death within the hour, regardless of any information he might possess. Sarah's journey to this moment had been shaped by experiences that made her uniquely suited to understand the complexity of wartime medical decisions. Born in San Francisco's Chinatown to parents who had immigrated from Canton Province, she had grown up navigating between Chinese cultural traditions and American societal expectations. Her father, Dr. James Chen, had been one of the few Chinese physicians allowed to practice in California despite facing constant discrimination and legal barriers that limited where he could work and live. From childhood, Sarah had accompanied her father on his rounds through Chinatown, learning to see patients not as representatives of political systems or military forces, but as individual human beings deserving of medical care regardless of their circumstances. Dr. Chen had often treated patients who couldn't pay, who spoke no English, or who belonged to groups that other physicians refused to serve. His example had taught Sarah that medical ethics transcended nationality, race, and political allegiance. When the United States entered World War II following Pearl Harbor, Sarah had been completing her nursing training at UCSF Medical School. The attack had created complex emotions within the Chinese-American community, which found itself allied with a country that had been fighting Japan for over 4 years. Many Chinese families, including Sarah's, had relatives in China who were suffering under Japanese occupation, creating personal reasons for supporting the American war effort. But Sarah's decision to volunteer for military nursing service had been motivated by medical rather than political considerations. She understood that war created massive casualties requiring skilled medical personnel, and she believed her training and cultural background could be valuable in treating wounded soldiers from diverse backgrounds. Her fluency in Mandarin and Cantonese, combined with her medical skills, made her particularly useful for treating Chinese-American service members and potentially for gathering intelligence from captured enemy soldiers. What would you do if your medical training conflicted with military orders during wartime? The Pacific Theater had presented Sarah with medical challenges unlike anything she had encountered during her civilian training. The tropical diseases, combat injuries, and psychological trauma afflicting American forces required innovative treatment approaches using limited supplies under primitive conditions. Field hospitals on Pacific Islands operated with minimal equipment, irregular supply deliveries, and constant threat of enemy attack, forcing medical personnel to improvise solutions that would have been impossible in civilian hospitals. Sarah's medical unit had arrived on Iwo Jima during the 3rd day of the American invasion, as Marine Corps forces were beginning their assault on the island's heavily fortified Japanese defensive positions. The battle was proving far more costly than military planners had anticipated, with American casualties mounting rapidly as Japanese defenders fought with fanatical determination from underground bunkers and tunnel systems that had taken months to construct. The field hospital where Sarah worked was located in a reinforced shell crater approximately 1 mile behind the advancing American lines, close enough to provide rapid treatment for wounded Marines, but far enough from the fighting to avoid direct enemy fire. The facility consisted of several large tents connected by covered walkways, with basic surgical equipment, limited pharmaceutical supplies, and communications equipment for coordinating medical evacuations to hospital ships offshore. The wounded Japanese soldier had been brought to the hospital by a Marine patrol that had found him unconscious near a destroyed pillbox during their advance toward Mount Sumbachi. Standard procedure required enemy wounded to be searched for weapons and intelligence materials before receiving medical treatment. But the Marine medic who had examined him reported that his injuries were life-threatening and required immediate surgical intervention. Sarah's commanding officer, Major Robert Harrison, had been treating American casualties in the main surgical tent when the Japanese soldier was brought in. Harrison was an experienced military surgeon who had served throughout the Pacific Campaign, but he was also a strict disciplinarian who insisted on following military protocols regardless of circumstances. When informed about the enemy wounded, he had ordered that the Japanese soldier be placed in a holding area until American casualties had been treated. But Sarah had examined the Japanese soldier while Major Harrison was performing surgery on an American Marine, and her medical assessment indicated that waiting would be fatal. The shrapnel wounds had severed major blood vessels in his left arm and shoulder, creating hemorrhaging that could only be controlled through immediate surgical intervention. Without surgery within the next hour, the soldier would certainly die from blood loss. The decision Sarah faced was both medical and moral. Military regulations clearly stated that enemy wounded were lower priority than American casualties. But her medical training emphasized that physicians and nurses had obligations to preserve life regardless of political considerations. The Hippocratic oath she had taken upon entering the medical profession required her to provide care to all patients who needed treatment, without regard to nationality or military affiliation. More personally, Sarah understood that the wounded Japanese soldier was probably no older than many of the American Marines she had been treating. Despite the propaganda that portrayed Japanese soldiers as inhuman fanatics, she could see that this was a young man, possibly with family and loved ones in Japan, who was suffering from injuries that any competent medical professional could treat successfully. Have you ever had to choose between following orders and doing what you believed was morally right? Sarah's decision was complicated by the racial dynamics that affected her position within the American military medical system. As a Chinese-American woman, she faced suspicion and discrimination from some personnel who questioned her loyalty and competence. Treating an enemy soldier against direct orders could be interpreted as evidence of divided loyalties, potentially ending her military career and subjecting her to court-martial proceedings for disobedience and possibly treason. But Sarah also understood that her unique cultural background gave her insights that other American medical personnel might lack. Her understanding of Asian cultures and languages meant that she might be able to communicate with the wounded Japanese soldier in ways that could provide valuable intelligence information. If she could save his life and establish rapport through compassionate medical care, he might be willing to provide information about Japanese defensive positions and military capabilities. After agonizing over the decision for several minutes while monitoring the Japanese soldier's declining vital signs, Sarah made a choice that would define her military service and personal integrity. She began preparing surgical instruments and medical supplies necessary to treat his wounds, understanding that she was directly violating Major Harrison's orders and potentially exposing herself to serious military discipline. Working with extraordinary efficiency developed through months of battlefield medicine, Sarah began treating the Japanese soldier's hemorrhaging wounds. She established intravenous access to provide blood replacement fluids, administered pain medication to reduce his suffering, and began the delicate process of repairing damaged blood vessels in his shoulder and arm. The surgery required meticulous attention to detail under primitive conditions, using equipment and techniques adapted for battlefield rather than hospital use. The Japanese soldier regained consciousness during the surgical procedure, his eyes showing initial fear and confusion as he realized he was being treated by an American medical team. Sarah spoke to him in Mandarin, explaining that she was providing medical treatment and that he was safe from further harm. Her ability to communicate in a language he partially understood seemed to reduce his anxiety, allowing her to continue the surgical procedure with his cooperation. As Sarah worked to save the Japanese soldier's life, she became aware that her actions were being observed by other medical personnel and wounded American Marines who were waiting for treatment. The reactions were mixed. Some appeared puzzled by her decision to treat an enemy soldier. Others seemed impressed by her surgical skill and compassionate approach to medical care. And a few displayed obvious disapproval of her apparent disobedience to military orders. The surgical procedure required nearly 2 hours to complete, during which time Sarah had to constantly monitor the patient's vital signs while repairing complex vascular damage using limited supplies and equipment. The technical challenges were enormous, requiring her to improvise surgical techniques and adapt civilian medical procedures to battlefield conditions. But her training and determination enabled her to successfully stop the hemorrhaging and begin the healing process. When Major Harrison completed his surgery on the American Marine and discovered that Sarah had operated on the Japanese soldier without authorization, his reaction was immediate and severe. He demanded explanations for her actions, questioned her loyalty to American forces, and threatened to file charges for disobedience and unauthorized medical proceedings. The confrontation took place in front of other medical personnel and wounded soldiers, creating a public crisis that could have ended Sarah's military career. Share your thoughts in the comments below about standing up for your principles when facing severe consequences. Sarah's response to Major Harrison's accusations was both professional and principled. She acknowledged that she had violated his direct orders, but explained that her medical assessment had indicated that immediate surgery was necessary to preserve the patient's life. She emphasized that her actions were motivated by medical rather than political considerations, and that her successful treatment of the enemy soldier demonstrated American commitment to humanitarian principles even during wartime. More importantly, Sarah pointed out that her treatment of the Japanese soldier had already produced valuable intelligence benefits. During the surgical procedure, the wounded soldier had provided information about Japanese defensive positions, troop strengths, and supply problems that could be useful for American military planning. His gratitude for receiving compassionate medical care had him willing to cooperate with American intelligence officers in ways that might not have been possible if he had been allowed to die from his wounds. The intelligence information that Sarah obtained from the Japanese soldier proved to be remarkably accurate and valuable. He provided detailed descriptions of underground tunnel systems that Japanese forces were using to move between defensive positions, identified locations where ammunition and supplies were being stored, and revealed communication procedures that Japanese units were using to coordinate their defensive operations. Most significantly, the Japanese soldier disclosed that Japanese forces on Iwo Jima were experiencing severe supply shortages that were affecting their ability to continue fighting effectively. Ammunition was running low, medical supplies were virtually exhausted, and food rationing had weakened many defenders. This information suggested that sustained American pressure could force Japanese surrender more quickly than military planners had anticipated. The intelligence benefits of Sarah's medical decision began influencing American military operations within hours of her surgery. Artillery strikes were redirected to target supply depots and tunnel entrances that the Japanese soldier had identified, while infantry units modified their tactics to exploit weaknesses in Japanese defensive positions. The information contributed directly to American tactical successes that reduced casualties on both sides. Major Harrison's anger about Sarah's disobedience was gradually tempered by recognition of the practical benefits her actions had produced. While he maintained that she had violated military protocols, he also acknowledged that her medical skill and cultural knowledge had generated intelligence that was proving valuable for ongoing military operations. The contradiction between military discipline and practical results created a complex situation that required resolution at higher command levels. The crisis was ultimately resolved by Colonel Patricia Williams, the chief medical officer for American forces in the Pacific Theater, who flew to Iwo Jima specifically to investigate Sarah's case. Colonel Williams was a pioneering female military surgeon who had spent her career fighting gender discrimination within the military medical system, and she understood the complexities facing minority medical personnel serving in combat zones. After reviewing the circumstances of Sarah's decision and evaluating the intelligence benefits that had resulted from her treatment of the Japanese soldier, Colonel Williams concluded that Sarah's actions represented exemplary military medicine that honored both medical ethics and practical military needs. Rather than facing court-martial proceedings, Sarah was commended for her surgical skill, intelligence gathering, and demonstration of American humanitarian values. Let us know in the comments how you think Sarah's courage affected others around her. The resolution of Sarah's case had broader implications for American military medical policy in the Pacific Theater. Her successful treatment of an enemy soldier, while generating valuable intelligence, demonstrated that compassionate medical care could serve both humanitarian and military objectives simultaneously. This recognition led to modifications in protocols governing treatment of enemy wounded, allowing medical personnel greater discretion in providing care when circumstances warranted. Sarah's actions also influenced the attitudes of American military personnel who had witnessed her treatment of the Japanese soldier. Many Marines and medical staff who had initially questioned her decision came to understand that her compassionate approach to enemy wounded reflected strength rather than weakness, and that professional medical care could serve American military interests while maintaining moral principles. The Japanese soldier whose life Sarah had saved eventually recovered sufficiently to be transferred to a prisoner of war facility in Hawaii, where he continued to provide valuable intelligence information to American interrogators. His gratitude for receiving professional medical care had created a cooperative relationship that produced intelligence benefits throughout the remainder of the war. Years later, in a letter written after the war ended, the former Japanese soldier thanked Sarah for saving his life and expressed his belief that her compassionate treatment had demonstrated the fundamental humanity that connected people across national and cultural boundaries. He credited her medical care with helping him understand that wars were fought between political systems rather than between individual human beings who shared common hopes and fears. Sarah's service on Iwo Jima continued for 6 weeks until American forces secured the island following one of the bloodiest battles in Pacific theater history. During that period, she treated hundreds of American casualties while also providing medical care to dozens of Japanese wounded who were captured during the fighting. Her reputation for professional competence and humanitarian principles made her one of the most respected medical personnel in the Pacific theater. After the war ended, Sarah returned to civilian medicine in San Francisco, where she used her military experience to develop innovative treatment approaches for trauma victims and veterans suffering from combat-related psychological problems. Her wartime service had demonstrated that medical excellence could be combined with cultural sensitivity and humanitarian principles to achieve results that served both professional and moral objectives. In 1965, 20 years after the end of World War II, Sarah was invited to participate in a medical conference in Tokyo that brought together American and Japanese physicians to discuss advances in trauma surgery and emergency medicine. During the conference, she was reunited with the Japanese soldier whose life she had saved on Iwo Jima, who had become a physician himself and was working to improve medical care for wounded veterans in Japan. The reunion was emotionally overwhelming for both individuals, representing a completion of the healing process that had begun with Sarah's decision to provide compassionate medical care during one of the war's most brutal battles. Their meeting demonstrated that individual acts of humanity during wartime could create lasting connections that transcended national boundaries and political differences. Sarah Chen died in 1998 at age 81, having spent her life demonstrating that medical excellence and humanitarian principles could coexist even under the most challenging circumstances. Her military service had proven that courage sometimes manifested as compassion rather than aggression, and that moral principles can serve practical objectives while maintaining professional integrity. The surgical instruments that Sarah used to save the Japanese soldier's life on Iwo Jima are now displayed in the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C., where they serve as reminders that medical personnel face unique ethical challenges during wartime. The display includes quotes from Sarah's military service record, emphasizing that medical care represents humanity's highest aspirations even during its most destructive conflicts. Today, Sarah's story is taught in military medical training programs as an example of how medical personnel can navigate the complex ethical challenges of providing care during wartime. Her decision to treat an enemy soldier despite military protocols demonstrates that individual moral courage can serve both humanitarian and practical objectives while maintaining the highest standards of medical professionalism. Lieutenant Sarah Chen's legacy reminds us that heroism often takes the form of compassionate action rather than dramatic gestures, and that individual decisions to preserve life can have consequences that extend far beyond immediate circumstances. Her story proves that moral principles and practical objectives need not conflict, and that courage can manifest as dedication to healing rather than commitment to destroying. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to share your thoughts.